Well, I'm sure you've all heard the old saying, never discuss politics and religion in polite company. Are you familiar with that one? Politics and religion are often considered these taboo topics of conversation, especially for sitting around the dinner table or going to family holidays or chatting with your coworkers around the water cooler. Engaging in political or religious discourse can also be seen as tacky or poor manners or kind of rude. And politics should certainly not be discussed in the church, right? Well, I was looking up the history of this quote, and it's typically attributed to Mark Twain, a fellow Missourian, but the thing is, he didn't actually say it. Instead, here's what he actually wrote about religion and politics. He says, I am quite sure now that often, very often, in matters concerning religion and politics, a man's reasoning powers are not above the monkeys. And I really think that Mark Twain may have been onto something, because it seems like over the past few years, our ability to engage in reasonable and polite discourse has steadily devolved, just going back to the brains of monkeys. As a society, our conversations around politics and religion have become more toxic, more divisive, and more polarized. And this is Christians and non-Christians alike. We're both guilty of behaving horribly in how we engage in political or religious discourse. People that we see normally as being kind and loving can be just plain mean on social media, or downright toxic when we start discussing presidential candidates or religious differences. Now, I don't want you to raise your hands, but without raising your hands, how many of you have had to block or mute someone on social media because you just got tired of seeing their political and rhetoric and divisive discourse? How many of you have been told that you aren't a true Christian or a real Christian because of what you believe or how you vote or how you interpret the Bible? How many of us have lost friendships and relationships over politics or religion? Two authors I'm going to reference a lot in this sermon are Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers, and they write that somewhere along the way, we stopped disagreeing with each other and started hating each other. Now, because our society is so polarized and divided, many of us assume that the solution is just to never discuss politics or religion, right? We go back to that old adage, let's just avoid conflict altogether. We just need to all get along and be happy. But of course, this doesn't solve the root issue. Now, alternatively, we might believe that we simply need to figure out the best way to convince the other side that we're right and they're wrong. If we have just the best words and the right argument, then everyone would be on our side. There wouldn't be any conflict anymore because we would all just agree with me. Well, disclaimer, this sermon series is not about how to convince people that they are wrong and you are right. This series isn't about winning or losing or having the last word. Instead, over the next few weeks during the month of May, we are going to relearn how to engage in conflict and disagreements peaceably and in Christ-like ways. We need to engage in tough conversations with love and respect and empathy. We need to learn how to talk to each other again. We need to learn how to cross the difference divide. Now, while many of us tend toward conflict avoidance, conflict in itself isn't bad or negative. And in fact, conflict can be very healthy if handled the right way. Conflict is also an inevitable part of human relationships. If you are close with someone, whether it's your best friend or your spouse or another family member, you will inescapably run into disagreements and conflict. Now, when I lead couples through premarital counseling, I often ask them how conflict was handled in their homes growing up. Did you ever see your parents fight? Or was conflict always handled privately behind closed doors? Did you ever see disagreements and arguments reach a peaceable solution? Were you allowed to disagree with your parents, or were all your questions just shot down? Did your parents ever model how to apologize to each other? Did your parents ever apologize to you? Because when we get married, for better or for worse, we tend to imitate the conflict patterns that were modeled to us in our households of origin. Now, often, parents believe that they shouldn't fight in front of their children, but not fighting in front of your kids often sets up unrealistic expectations that they will also never engage in conflict with their friends or their significant others. But instead, when parents or family members can model arguing without being hurtful, without yelling or raising your voices, then they can display loving disagreement and teach their children that we can still love each other even when we disagree, even when we're in conflict. I believe that same thing can be true for the church. That we as Christians, as we model healthy conflict and disagreement towards one another, can show the world what it looks like to disagree peaceably. In conflict, it can even help us grow closer to each other as we gain more empathy and understanding, as we hear the other person out and learn more about their position. So that's why learning to engage in healthy conflict is so important. Now, in his life and ministry, Jesus did not shy away from conflict or tough conversations. He frequently and openly engaged in disagreements with the Pharisees and the Jewish religious leaders. He would upset them because of who he ate with, as he ate with tax collectors and sinners and people that were generally considered unclean or outcasts. He even called them a brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs, which I guess were really bad insults in that day. He got into fights with them about the appropriateness of healing on the Sabbath, and he would even call them out for neglecting the poor and the widows and the oppressed. And famously, Jesus even went into the temple and drove out the merchants from God's holy house, and he flipped over the tables of the money changers, and he drove out all their animals into the street. No, Jesus was definitely not conflict avoidant. But I really appreciate Paul's words of wisdom about conflict when he writes this in Ephesians 4:26. In your anger, do not sin. So he doesn't say that we shouldn't ever get angry, that we should avoid conflict altogether. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to have conflict. It's even okay to be passionate about a particular cause or angry in the face of some injustice. But in our anger, we are not to sin. And throughout that passage, he kind of explains what this means. We're to get rid of all bitterness, not to engage in brawling, physical fighting, not to engage in slander or telling lies about others. We're not to lose our temper. We're not to steal. We shouldn't disparage or belittle others. In your anger, do not sin. So conflict is good, conflict is healthy, and conflict is even necessary. Because without conflict, we tend to stay stuck. We'll never grow. In many ways, complete and total agreement is way overrated. But when we enter into disagreements, when we have conflict, when we have those tense conversations, we always must lead with grace. Now, in the United Methodist Church, we talk a lot about grace. And our beliefs about God's grace are some of our most defining doctrines and theologies as a denomination. But I think, unfortunately, on all our talk about grace, sometimes it leads to more confusion. Grace has become kind of this broad or amorphous concept that's hard to define, it's hard to pin down. Just like we sang in that hymn a couple minutes ago, many of us understand grace as unmerited favor from God. We didn't earn it, we don't deserve it, but God loves us anyway. And that, of course, is certainly true. God sees us through the eyes of grace. Though we are flawed and reckless beings, we are always loved by God. But sometimes when we have this lovey-dovey, feel-good view of God's grace, we lose what it means to have that same sort of grace to each other, to view each other through the eyes of grace, to lead with grace in our lives and in our conversations. Both of our scripture passages, even though they don't use the word grace, they articulate what it looks like to lead with grace. First, in Ephesians 4:32, it says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you." That's grace. And then similarly in Colossians, it says, "Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance with somebody. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity." So we are to extend the same grace and forgiveness that we have received from God toward one another, especially in times of disagreement and conflict. Now, Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers are two Christian women who are not shy about conflict. They are from Tennessee, and for the past 10 years, they have hosted a podcast called Pantsuit Politics. And in this podcast, they talk about every hot topic issue under the sun. And sometimes they disagree with each other. Sometimes they disagree with the guests that they bring on. And over the years, their political positions have often changed or adapted or evolved. But one thing in their podcast has never changed, and that is that they always strive to lead with grace first and foremost. So in this book that they wrote together, which I kind of like the title, it's called "I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening." They say this: "When we talk on the podcast about the need for grace in our political conversations, we mean infusing discussions with kindness and respect for no reason other than to uphold the dignity of our fellow humans. We mean extending the same unmerited love that we receive from God, that we believe flows from God, even to our most strident political adversaries." So for Sarah and Beth, grace means recognizing that every person is created in God's divine image and thus is worthy of our respect. Even politicians are human beings worthy of our respect. Every human is fearfully and wonderfully made, no exceptions. So because of this, on their podcast, they don't tolerate any conversation that dehumanizes, belittles, or demonizes another person. We can disagree with each other without tearing each other down or attacking the inherent value and dignity of another person. We can be in conflict with somebody without telling horrendous lies about them or spreading malicious rumors. And that's essentially what Paul was saying in Ephesians 4:29. "Don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." Now, I like that translation, but I really like that last part in the NRSV version. It says, "May our words give grace to those who hear." Lead with grace. Lead with grace, not by tearing others down. Another book I've read is by a pastor named Eugene Cho, and he puts it like this: "Jesus died and extended grace for the left, the right, and everyone in between. We must stop vilifying and demonizing those we disagree with." Now, Sarah and Beth, they also talk a lot about how when we extend grace to other people, we can more easily receive that same grace for ourselves. Extending grace to ourselves facilitates the belief in our own value and worthiness, that our voices and our choices belong. We all have something important to say. We all have something unique to contribute to the conversation. So when we offer grace to others, it allows for growth in ourselves. It enables us to acknowledge that we may have gotten a few things wrong along the way. Now, when I look back at some of the beliefs I've held throughout my life, whether it's political beliefs or religious beliefs, I am sometimes embarrassed or ashamed of what I used to believe. But when I offer grace to myself, I'm able to learn and grow from my past mistakes. Offering grace to myself means that my views and my beliefs, they're still changing, they're still evolving and shaping, something that I hope never stops. When we look back on the growth in our own lives with grace and compassion, we are more ready to believe that someone else can grow and change as well. That's what grace means. But Sarah and Beth, they're also really quick to say what grace is not. They write this: Grace isn't rolling over or acquiescing to those who have completely different values than we do. It is simply seeing our shared connections and acknowledging each other's human dignity. Grace simply means that all people are valuable. It does not mean that all opinions are valid. So showing grace doesn't mean you have to change your core beliefs or your core values. In fact, that's what we're going to talk about next week, defining our values. Rather, leading with grace means recognizing the worthiness and dignity in every person we encounter, even those we really disagree with. Now, finally, Sarah and Beth recognize that sometimes the most gracious thing we can do, both for ourselves and for the other person, is sometimes to walk away. We have permission to walk away from unhealthy and unproductive conflict, whether it's in person or online or social media. When it is clear that an argument isn't going anywhere, it may be time to stop having it. Now, we may be 100% absolutely right and correct in the situation, but we need to decide if it's more important to be right than it is to be in right relationship with the other person. Leading with grace means prioritizing kindness over being right. I like how Paul puts it in Romans 12:18. He says, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. You cannot control or change the other person. You can't change their mind or convince them that they are right or you are right and they're wrong. You can only control your own actions and your own behaviors. So as far as it depends on you, strive for peace and lead with grace. Leading with grace means protecting your own worthiness and value and personhood. If you are in a discussion that violates your basic human dignity, you can disengage. You can walk away. We do not have to tolerate discussion that actually harms ourselves or other humans around us. Because you too are divinely created in God's image. You are worthy of value and dignity, and you don't have to put up with conversation that hurts, abuses, or harms you in any way. Because sometimes the most gracious thing you can do is walk away. Now, I believe that the communion table is one of the most beautiful pictures of grace that we have in the church. As a pastor, one of the most profound privileges and responsibilities I have is to welcome people to this communion table. Because of the grace and love of Jesus, we get to invite all to the table. Now, I don't know of any other institution or organization or club that gathers people from all different backgrounds, all different ethnicities and walks of life, different political inclinations and political views, different beliefs or traditions, and brings them all together around one table. When we have communion, we don't get to have a line for the left and a line for the right. We all drink from the same cup and eat from the same loaf. At this table, we have to make space for one another, even those we disagree with. Engaging with people, leading with grace, diving into conflict, it is never easy and it is often messy, but it is always worth it. Now, at the Last Supper, when Jesus instituted the sacrament of communion, he willingly ate with Judas. He willingly shared dinner with the man who would soon betray him and lead him to his own execution. So in the book, Beth Silver shares a story about how her church put on a living Last Supper play for Maundy Thursday. And after his betrayal of Jesus, the actor portraying Judas left the stage. At the end of the performance, the actors playing Jesus and the disciples, they formed a line to administer communion to the congregation, and the whole audience came up in a line to receive the bread and the cup. And there, at the very end of the line, was the actor portraying Judas. He stood and he took the bread and the cup from Jesus in a powerful reminder of Christian grace. That is what it means to lead with grace. So I invite you now to come and receive this gift of God's grace at the communion table.